Hello and welcome everybody once again to this video series on negotiations. My name is Tasin, and in this fifth part of negotiations, I'll be sharing a few more tips and advice on the topic of negotiation. So let me get started with today. Alright, so the first tip that I have on the topic of negotiation for today is the three objectives to keep in mind when negotiating the process. So the first objective would be to get clarity on the process at the lowest level, also on the parties involved and the timeline of the negotiation. The second objective would be to get a commitment from the other, counterparty. It could be in the form of an assurance that the process will go through, or it can also be like a verbal promise. The third objective when negotiating the process would be to basically have the opportunity to change the process further into the negotiation. The second tip that I have on the topic of negotiation for today is to avoid strategic mistakes by mapping out the negotiation space. So what I mean by that is to have a map map out a space where you know all the parties that are relevant to the negotiation. So basically all the parties that either influence the deal or would be influenced by the deal. The next tip that I have for on the topic of negotiations is basically leading and negotiating during a crisis. So I basically have 5 tips when it comes to negotiating during a crisis. The first is get yourself a team. You cannot just rely on yourself in this situation. You have to have a team to support you during this crisis. The second point would be to buy yourself as much time as you can and try to sleep on it and think about your decisions. The third tip would be to zoom out and think about what this would look like, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, and also make sure you keep an eye on all the stakeholders involved. The fourth thing that you should keep in mind is to make time to audit your strengths. You likely have some leverage in the negotiation, and that might change during the timeline, so you might always want to audit your strengths. And the fifth point would be to use your mission values as a filter. So this is basically the time you use your organization's mission value to really filter out what matters and what doesn't. The next advice for today would be an advice for when you're not negotiating with the final decision maker. In such a situation, you should be sure that the person who will be speaking on behalf of you is an effective ambassador of the message that you want to send. When they leave the room, they should remember what you want them to remember. The next tip on the topic of negotiation for today would be how to fail smarter during difficult negotiations. So you should basically have 3 objectives in mind on failing smarter during negotiations. The first objective would be that you should gain respect, right? You should not lose credibility during the process. You should rather gain credibility and respect during the entire process of negotiation. The second objective that you should have in mind should be to learn as much as you can about the counterparty, their values, their principles, and what they really want from this negotiation. And the third thing that you might want to learn is basically you should have made sure that you've sown the seed so that the next time you start, you're in a better position to negotiate than you were this time. The next advice on the topic of negotiation would be The benefit of honestly revealing your priorities in a negotiation. So there is a risk if you do not reveal all your priorities, or you try to hide all the priorities that you have during the negotiations. There might be a lot of assumptions from the other side, and what that might do is they might not really understand what you want to achieve from this negotiation. So you should have made sure that during this negotiation process, you've clearly stated what your objectives and values and priorities from this negotiation is. The negotiator should also be aware that you don't just assume that they understand all the signals that you're trying to send. You should explicitly, at times, state your objectives from this negotiation. The next advice would be, when negotiating, don't let your offer speak for itself. So what I mean by that is, always tell the story that goes with it, right? It also conveys what you really want and how you see it, right? And not what they assume things to be. Next thing would be, are you too focused on getting a yes in the negotiations? If that is the case, you might want to sit down and think about it and change your strategy so as to not have a yes, but rather fail smarter, as we discussed in the earlier point. A next piece of advice would be to have a strategy for avoiding future conflict to normalize this process of negotiation. Now, this is where a mediator really helps. So what the mediator does is, it basically prepares both the parties that during the negotiation there might be times when you would have bitter arguments and you might really disagree and hate each other. But what the mediator would like to and eventually want to communicate to both the parties is that at the end of the negotiation, although things might have been rough, at the end both the parties would have achieved what they really wanted to. The next tip would be a strategy. So basically, the next tip would be when to use ultimatums and when to avoid them during negotiations. Now, the downside of ultimatums is that it creates bad blood. Yeah, it sort of can be seen as bullying from the counterparty. So when should you really use ultimatums during the negotiation process, and when should you refrain from ultimatums? So basically, there are two criteria that you should keep in mind when deciding whether to use ultimatums or not. The first criteria would be to never make an ultimatum unless you're willing to act on it. So what I mean by that is, if you say you would like to exit the negotiation at some point, you should be in a position to exit the negotiation. Because if you don't, then you will lose credibility and you will appear weak and you would have lost all leverage. And the second point would be basically, is there a less aggressive way to put your point across? And if it is, why do we not want to use that instead of going for an ultimatum? And then the final point for today on this topic of negotiation would be, don't let your negotiations end in a no. Let it end in either why it didn't work out, and you gaining more information so that the next time you are in the negotiation you get a yes. And I hope that helps you with this topic on negotiation. Thank you for your attention, and thank you everybody who's been throughout this series. So yeah, with that, at the end of this topic on negotiation. Do give me your feedback. Let me know in the comments how you found this series, if you did find value, if it did help you. And if it did help you, I would appreciate if you could drop a good subscribe to the channel, drop a comment of how this helped you in your negotiation. And please support this channel so that I can keep posting more videos on career and yeah, advice on other interesting topics. Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye.